the same.
Both Twitter and Facebook said in February that tougher measures would be taken to tackle the issue. Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, announced a tool which means you can automatically filter out abusive messages from people you don't follow. I wonder if those filtered out messages then get sent to Instagram so they can see what people are posting. Let's find out a little bit more about this. And the law, too. Steve Kuntsevich is a legal commentator and lawyer who specialises in defamation and social media law. Steve, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
First of all, where does the law stand on this? If, for example, we'll take me as an example because I can't sue myself for defamation, I don't think. If I were to post some racist abuse on a social media platform, is it me who gets into trouble, or is it me and the platform, or is it the platform?
Well, as of right now, it's you that gets into trouble. And the reason for that is the platforms have been pretty protected for years and years and years, in that if they're not aware of racial abuse going on their platform, they only normally need to take action to take something down. When somebody does make them aware of it, it's usually going to be a breach of their terms of use. And depending upon what you say, it might be a civil claim. So if it's something that could affect your reputation, it's a defamation claim, or it might cross the line into criminal. It might be harassment, it might be incitement. And there are a number of specific offences that deal with what you say and don't say on social media. But what I think we're seeing here is an example of some particular high-profile personalities on social media saying to the platforms, you need to do more. And that's going to be important because they use them to, if you like, help generate advertising income. These are players that are working clubs that might in particular spend a lot of money with the platforms. And what we're looking at as well is the government introducing new legislation to introduce a duty of care on the platforms to deter harm to their users. Now, it's going to take a while for that to come in, but the idea is that the UK is going to be the safest place in the world to be online. That's the clearly stated aim. Now, that's a while away, and that's something that's going to be subject to lobbying from the platform. But we are going to be the first country in the world to try and regulate social media to stop things like this happening. So it's the public and the players in this particular case have been pushing for this kind of thing for a long time. And although it's a while off, it does look as if that's the direction of travel.
So as it stands, platforms aren't responsible, and when we talk about platforms, we're talking here about sort of Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, all these social media companies. They're not responsible for anything that's published on them at the moment, then?
Well, they're responsible for how personal data is used, for example, but the European law that's covered this kind of thing, the e-commerce regulations that came into UK law years ago, say, as I said before, that if they're not aware of this kind of thing, then they normally only need to take action when somebody tells them to do so. And although they've worked quite closely with governments to look as if they are taking action, the more they do, then the more is expected of them. So they've been quite insulated legally. But as I say, when the online harms legislation comes in, that is all going to change. And to the extent that it changes, we just don't know just yet.
But surely it wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility. These are some of the smartest tech companies in the world, of course, that there are certain words that it's very difficult for them not to be deemed offensive or racist. Can't they flag these up and pull these out straight away?
That's a great point, and it's a very fair one, because they, of course, control the platforms, they, of course, control the tech. And if they wanted to filter this kind of thing out, there is an argument to say that they could do pretty effectively. But the issue that raises is obviously going to be around free speech. Now, I think it's fairly safe to argue that none of this qualifies as free speech because it's just appalling racist language that nobody should be using. But that's the balance that they'll say that they're having to weigh up. And if you're looking at this from a criminal perspective, again, racist abuse is never justifiable in any way, shape or form. There is a real concern about the platforms in particular banning more than they should be. So this is a debate that's going to rage over the course of at least the next 12 to 18 months. But certainly you would imagine that when some of the biggest users, the most famous users of these platforms are starting to object to this kind of thing, that the platforms may start sitting up and taking notice and doing a little bit more.
So when the Premier League teams and the EFL teams and others say we're not going to use social media for 3 or 4 days, how much does that hit the pocket of these companies?
That depends. If you look at any of the big clubs, they will be looking to engage with their fans on social media as often as is humanly possible, notably during the last 12 months worth of lockdown. where there hasn't been that many games played. So I think it's more of a symbolic gesture than a financial one. If you were to get someone like Manchester United or Manchester City, for example, saying that they're going to pull all of their Twitter campaigns, then that will hit Twitter fairly squarely. But again, I think it's more about the importance of who's doing it and why, rather than how much it's going to cost for the moment. A few days may not make that much difference, but at least it's a start.
And could it, and this is maybe more of a question, I don't know, for a behavioural psychologist or a sociologist than someone who's involved in the law, but I'll ask you anyway. Could it affect the fans too? If they see their role models standing up for this in the way that they are, might they think twice about some of the things they may consider posting? Or the other one, I suppose, is sharing, passing stuff on that might be deemed offensive?
I think we can't lose sight of the fact that social media in all its forms is still pretty much a young medium. Now, that doesn't excuse this kind of abuse, but I do think there's a bit of a disconnect between what people post and understanding the effect that that has on the person that receives that message. And until we all really get comfortable with the fact that, this really can not just hurt people's feelings, but lead to extraordinary, terrible kinds of abuse. What this is going to need, I think, is a change in behaviour, and we're a way away from that yet. But certainly where you've got role models standing up and doing the right thing, then you would hope that people would follow their example. And if they want to share the message of defiance, if you like, then that might get out and show that social media can sometimes be a good platform for this kind of thing, where you do want to share a real cause. So I suppose it remains to be seen, probably for someone who has a bit more experience in psychology than I do. But as I say, it's a start, and that's probably about the best we can hope for at the moment.
And maybe on a philosophical point, that argument that I know the lawyers will argue about till the cows come home, about free speech versus offence and the right to offend or the right to feel offended, how on earth are we going to conclude that one?
That's a great question. If you're looking at this through the criminal lens, what the CPS guidelines say is that you're allowed to be iconoclastic, you're allowed to have a particular view, but you're not allowed to be, for example, and free speech and free opinion doesn't give you free rein to cause this kind of damage to the recipient of these kind of messages. And again, in a world where everybody all of a sudden has access to this kind of social media megaphone, I think the users of these platforms need to realise that with that power comes the risk of potentially someone holding true to that power.
And again, we'll use me as an example because A, I wouldn't, and B, I don't post on social media very often at all, frankly, because I find it too dangerous and scary. If I am of a mind to post racist stuff, what kind of penalties can I face? Because it can't be that hard to track some of these users down.
Well, it can actually, because you've got to remember a lot of these businesses are based outside the UK. If you wanted to sue somebody in the civil courts, for example, you'd have to get a court order, potentially in a foreign court, asking the platform to identify who's responsible so you can sue them. And if you sue them and they haven't got any money to be able to pay you damages or meet your costs as a result, then that's a really expensive hobby. What is easier is where you get the police asking questions when we're straying into criminal offences that they may want to pursue. But realistically, getting the police's attention to deal with things like this when they've got so much else to deal with isn't always easy. So the theory's there are ways to try and do it, but again, the platforms won't want to hand over user details without sometimes a court order. So it can be a bit more difficult than it may appear to be.
We should just be nice to each other. That'd be easier, wouldn't it?
Absolutely.
Steve, thanks very much for your time and your insight this afternoon. Steve Kuncevic is a legal commentator and lawyer specialising in defamation and social 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 defamation.